In this video tutorial, I'm going to go over preparing the canvas. And today I'm going to apply a layer of gesso on my canvas here. Gesso is basically a white acrylic paint. The reasons why we use gesso on the canvas are to seal the canvas, make it waterproof, and also to provide a textured surface that more easily accepts the paint. Because gesso is an acrylic paint, you can make it as textured or as smooth as you want. And this texture adds an additional interesting quality to your painting because it tends to show through the final product depending on how thickly you apply your paint. The pre-stretched canvases that you buy from your local hobby store or from any store typically have a layer of gesso already applied to them. And this is a very thin layer. You can still see the texture of the canvas through it. And so if you don't like that texture, if it's a little too distracting or you just don't prefer it, you can add more layers of gesso to that. The supplies you'll need to prepare your canvas include, of course, the canvas, bucket of gesso, paintbrush to apply the gesso. You also need a stirring stick, paper towels, and sandpaper. I'm using a very fine grit here. It's a 400 grit wet or dry sandpaper. On my canvas, I've already applied 2 layers of gesso. I prefer to have 3 or 4. I'm still getting some areas of the canvas texture showing through, and I kind of like to just get a more even surface. And the layers you have to let dry at least 24 hours before applying another layer. And I've also noticed that there are some textures that I'd like to smooth out a little bit that have dried. There are some air bubbles in here, and that's what the sandpaper is for. You can lightly sand out any undesired texture. So I'm going to go ahead and lightly sand out some of these air bubbles. You can sand as much or as little of the canvas as you want. If you apply enough layers of gesso, you can get it so smooth that you won't see any texture at all. It's just up to the artist's preference. Personally, I like to have a little bit of texture. I use such thin paint that the texture really shows through and adds an interesting quality to my paintings. In graduate school, I did a project where I copied one of my paintings, made an exact copy of it, and the first painting I didn't apply any additional layers of gesso to the canvas. I had bought a pre-primed canvas from a store, so you could still see the somewhat, it's kind of like pixelated, the canvas texture. But the copy painting that I made, I applied 3 layers of gesso to it, so you could see that texture better. And then in class, the students preferred the painting that had the 3 layers of gesso on it because they liked that texture showing through. And so that's why I do this. To start off, you're going to want to stir your gesso very well. Got your stirring stick here, and basically Just stir it up really well. You want to keep your stirring stick and the lid and the bucket as clean as possible. When the gesso dries, it can flake, and those little flakes can get in the gesso, and they're difficult to pick out of the gesso once they're in there. So I just try to keep the bucket and everything as clean as possible so that no debris, no flakes of dried paint get mixed in there. And then you just dip your paintbrush into the gesso and apply it in broad strokes to the canvas. I kind of like to brush the strokes in kind of every direction I can. It makes it a little more interesting and spreads it out a little more evenly that way as well. You'll also want to apply gesso to the sides of the canvas to seal those as well. The whiter the brush you use, the less time it'll take to apply the gesso to the canvas. I've got a 2-inch brush here. That's pretty small for this size canvas, but it also allows me to get a little more texture as well. You'll notice I'm kind of using the flat edge and kind of a side dragging along motion of the brush that makes the texture a little more smooth. Once it dries, that'll be less sanding I'll have to do. And that's basically it. Once you've applied a nice even layer over the entire canvas, gotten all the edges and the corners, let it dry for 24 hours before applying another layer or beginning painting on it. And as well, you're going to want to make sure that you clean the brush out very well with soap and water, and clean, of course, the stirring stick and any other mess that you make.